Age of Backlash, which is organized with the framework of the Memorandum of Understanding between the National Kapodistrian University of Athens and the Hellenic Observatory, part of the European Institute of the London School of Economics and Political Science. The roundtable will be open with an address by the Vice Rector for Academic Affairs, International Relations and Extroversion, Professor Sofia Papaioannou.
Dear Professor Tsaliki, distinguished colleagues, dear students and friends, it is a great pleasure to welcome you to the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens for this international roundtable discussion entitled After #MeToo, Feminist Politics in the Age of Backlash, organized on the occasion of the publication of the volume Me Too in the Media, edited by Professor Lili Chouliaraki. This event forms part of the Memorandum of Understanding between the University of Athens and the Hellenic Observatory Center for Research on Contemporary Greece and Cyprus, fostering international dialogue on gender, media, public discourse, and democracy in the contemporary world. The Me Too movement marked a historic turning point. It transformed personal experiences of harassment, abuse, and discrimination into a collective demand for accountability, justice, and structural change. Across societies, institutions, workplaces, and cultural environments, voices that had long been marginalized entered the public sphere with unprecedented force. The movement demonstrated that silence is never neutral and that public testimony can become a catalyst for profound social transformation. Yet, as history repeatedly teaches us, every significant advance toward equality encounters resistance. Today, we are witnessing what many scholars describe as an era of backlash, a period in which the achievements of feminist movements are questioned, minimized, or reframed through narratives that seek to restore older hierarchies and normalize exclusionary practices. The challenge before us is therefore not only to celebrate the progress that has been achieved, but also to remain vigilant, critical, and engaged. This is precisely why discussions such as today's are so important. The task is not merely to remember the moment of Me Too, but to ensure that its questions remain alive in our public conversations. How do media platforms shape the visibility of gendered violence? How do digital cultures amplify voices while simultaneously generating new forms of hostility and disinformation? How can feminist politics continue to build solidarities and democratic participation in a climate increasingly marked by polarization and resistance? These questions demand sustained scholarly attention and public engagement. We are particularly fortunate to have with us today an extraordinary group of internationally renowned scholars whose work has shaped contemporary debates on media, gender, feminism, and public culture. I warmly welcome Professor Sarah Bennett-Weiser, Rosalind Gill, Catherine Claire Higgins, and of course our distinguished editor and LSE colleague, Lili Chouliaraki. Their scholarship has fundamentally enriched our understanding of media cultures, feminist politics, digital communication, and the evolving dynamic of public discourse. I also wish to thank our colleague Lisa Tsaliki for her contribution to this important conversation, and Professor Lambrini Rory from the Political Science Department for chairing today's discussion. The National and Kapodistrian University of Athens is deeply committed to promoting equality, inclusion, and respect within academic life and beyond. In recent years, our institution has strengthened initiatives addressing gender equality, anti-discrimination policies, awareness-raising activities, support structures, and public dialogue on issues of gender-based violence and social justice. Universities, in general, have a special responsibility in times of social uncertainty. They must remain spaces where difficult questions can be asked, where critical thought can flourish, and where democratic values are defended through knowledge, dialogue, and evidence-based debate. Today's roundtable embodies precisely this mission. It reminds us that the work initiated by Me Too is not finished. It requires persistence, intellectual rigor, institutional commitment, and above all, the courage to keep these issues visible, even when public attention shifts elsewhere. Thank you all for being here with us this afternoon, and I wish you a stimulating and fruitful discussion. Thank you very much.
The roundtable discussion will be moderated by Assistant Professor Lambrini Rory from the Department of Political Science and Public Administration, School of Economics and Political Science of the National Kapodistrian University of Athens.
Good evening, and thank you very much for being here. It is a great pleasure and honor to chair this international roundtable after Me Too, Feminist Politics in the Age of Backlash, hosted by the University of Athens on the occasion of the recent publication of the volume of Me Too in the Media, edited by Professor Lili Chouliaraki. I would like to invite our first speaker, Professor Chouliaraki, to the stand in order to open the round of presentations.
So, good evening, everybody, and thank you all for being here. Thank you to esteemed Professor, Rector and Professor Sofia Papaioannou for her generous hospitality and introduction. Thank you to Professor Lisa Tsaliki for all your hard work to organize our roundtable so impeccably and for bringing attention to the edited book, Me Too στα Μέσα Επικοινωνίας. Thank you also to Professor Lambrini Rory for graciously agreeing to engage with our arguments and our discussions today. I am delighted and honored that you've agreed to be our discussant. And most of all, thank you to our speakers, Sarah, Ross, Kat, and Lisa, for being here. World-leading scholars at the forefront of feminist theorizing and media cultures, and it is just amazing for those of you who came for the panel to have you here in Athens. Most of all, thank you for your invaluable contributions to helping us understand Me Too as a distinct and ambivalent moment in 21st century feminism or other post-feminism. My own decision to work on this edited book stemmed precisely from engaging with your work and feeling that we urgently need to translate your words in Greek. We urgently need these conversations to inform our ongoing public debates here in my own culture and in our own language. And let me just add that Me Too στα μέσα επικοινωνίας also includes excellent contributions by brilliant Greek scholars, specifically on Me Too in Greece. Lisa's paper will refer to this context here today. So there will be another round table on this theme. It is now a couple of years since the book's publication, and a few more since the original research by our participants came out in English. Much has happened since, and our roundtable today is an invitation for us to reflect on the aftermath of Me Too as we experience it today. Me Too in the age of backlash. In the age, in other words, of a regressive pushback of far-right anti-feminism and misogyny around the world. Looking back over the past decade, if Me Too achieved anything, it was to offer women, cis and trans, the hope of visibility and recognition, the promise that women's experiences of violence could become public, acknowledged, and redressed. As women's testimonies went viral on social media platforms, concepts that were once marginalized, like consent, femicide, rape culture, entered our collective vocabulary. And even if these same platforms also reproduced familiar exclusions, privileging white middle-class, professionally visible women at the service of mostly white feminism, nonetheless, something appeared to shift. Questions of power, privilege, and hierarchy, as Ross Gill and my LSE colleague Shani Orgad have put it, became more mainstream. Powerful men were named, and at least in some cases, they were held accountable. As Gisèle Pellicot recently put it, it appears as if shame could indeed change sides. I'm not sure how to change the slide. In Greece, too, the rupture was palpable, at least for a while. The testimonies that emerged through the Greek Me Too made a new vocabulary of pain available to women. We spoke about consent, όχι σημαίνει όχι, and about believability. I believe her. Εγώ σε πιστεύω, αδερφή μου. 5 years on, not only have these acts of public recognition not translated into solid infrastructures of protection, prevention, or care, but under the pressures of this backlash, the very vocabularies of women's pain and recognition are fading in public discourse. This should not surprise us. We live in cultures of entrenched misogyny. Misogyny understood not in a simplistic way as men hating women, but following Kate Mann, misogyny as an invisible system that punishes women when they challenge the norms of patriarchy, when they fail, in other words, to provide what is expected of them in our societies: care, emotional labor, loyalty, sexual availability, or deference to male authority. Over the past decade, it is precisely this patriarchal order that helps explain the rise of anti-feminist politics. What drives much of the current drift towards illiberalism, towards a far-right hegemony is not only economic anxieties or political disillusionment, though of course those too. It is also a perceived sense of loss in male entitlement, a perceived loss of privileges as established hierarchies of gender, sexuality, and race are being challenged. As Sarah Bennett-Weiser explains in her work on popular feminism, the popular feminism of Me Too and the popular misogyny of anti-feminist discourses do not simply oppose each other, but they are produced in relation to one another. In other words, the anti-feminist backlash we experience today emerges precisely because of and against Me Too, precisely because of and against Black Lives Matter, precisely because of and against LGBTQ+ mobilizations. And it is directed against those very languages that we use to name vulnerability as structural. To say that some groups are not simply exposed to violence by chance, but made vulnerable by organized systems of harm, such as patriarchy. What in my own work I call the languages of pain. We witness this kind of backlash in the language of politicians, political parties, the law, and governmental decision-making, but we also witness it in culture, in mainstream and social media, through social media posts, through influencer talk, through online videos, where much of public discourse now takes place, especially for young people. What I find particularly dangerous about this kind of talk in politics and the media is that far-right feminism anti-feminism does not simply deny women's pain, though of course it does that too. More insidiously, it changes the conditions under which female pain can be recognized as victimhood. It controls, in other words, who is allowed to appear as a victim, how their pain or suffering is interpreted, and what political story or agenda this suffering is made to serve. So for the rest of my talk, I am going to name 3 mechanisms of far-right anti-feminism through which that work of control takes place. And these are, as you can see, weaponization, displacement, and erasure. So let me start with weaponization. One of the good things about Me Too is that it tried to challenge the ideal victim. The idea that in order for a woman to be recognized and treated as a victim, she has to be respectable, she has to be socially compliant, she has to be apolitical, she has to appear innocent and honest. Was she modest enough? What was she wearing? Did she drink too much? Was she genuinely upset? Me Too said no, it does not matter what she was wearing or whether she was drunk. She does not need to perform what Sarah and Kargen label the honest woman. She does not need to perform the labor of believability in order for us to recognize her as a victim. And again, remember the hashtags, αδερφή μου εγώ σε πιστεύω, ή με τη Σοφία για τη Σοφία Μπεκατόρου. Both hashtags denoting commitment to women's languages of pain rather than letting doubt about who they are to frame and ultimately cancel their testimonies of suffering. Now, the anti-feminist backlash brings the idea of the ideal victim back and repurposes it, reuses it to serve its own political narratives. In far-right discourse, women's suffering is recognized only when it is weaponized to vilify other vulnerable groups and to legitimize exclusionary and punitive policies, anti-migrant legislation, anti-trans governance, racialized policing, border violence. An example of this, I'm going to the US now, is of course Donald Trump's use of the language of defending women from specific threats, the migrant criminal and the trans woman. For instance, Trump's immigration politics repeatedly placed murdered women and girls at the center of his anti-migration messaging. He used two tragic femicides, both committed by migrants, the 22-year-old student Laken Riley and 12-year-old Jocelyn Nangray, in order to present all migrants as a special danger to all women. And his Laken-Riley Act transformed this misleading generalization into a detention and deportation agenda. However, what empirical evidence actually tells us is that the overwhelming percentage of perpetrators are found within the intimate and the domestic sphere where women live, both according to UN's global data and according to the European Institute for Gender Equality. The greatest majority of women and girls are killed not by migrants, but by intimate partners or family members. Moreover, just as it weaponizes women's death with respect to migration, the same administration has simultaneously banned abortion in 13 states and severely restricted it in many more. And just last year, Trump's new law, the One Big Beautiful Act, threatened to block access not only to abortion rights, to abortion-related care, but also to contraceptions, cancer screenings, and other reproductive health services. In summary, to finish the weaponization mechanism, female pain is selectively weaponized in anti-migrant and racist political narratives to punish other vulnerable groups, while that same pain is silenced and ignored when those narratives protect the powerful, the elites. The women victimized by Jeffrey Epstein and his elite circles are up against the highest echelons of power, and for this reason, they have been struggling for recognition and accountability for more than 25 years. Let me move on to, so that's the summary of my weaponization argument. The second mechanism by which the far-right backlash blocks the recognition of female victimhood is displacement. Displacement occurs when women's pain is acknowledged, but the center of sympathy moves on to men. This is what Kate Mann calls himpathy, from him and sympathy. In the media, in legal language, in politics, we consistently witness how attention shifts from the woman's injury to the man's loss. What about his reputation, his future, his talent? Oh, but he is good looking, he is too young, he was himself traumatized, he was himself suffering. A Greek example of this attention to the male perpetrator is that of Babis Anagностopoulos, the vile husband and murderer of young mother Caroline Crouch, who was frequently described by the Greek media as a handsome, young, successful helicopter pilot. And during his trial, the defense tried to establish a case that the victim was unstable and wanted to leave him, and that he killed her out of pathos and jealousy. And recent work on femicides in Greece I have done with LSE colleagues confirmed this pattern. Himpathy, however, is not really new. It has long been working as a mechanism of marginalizing female victimhood in favor of male fragility in patriarchal cultures like ours and elsewhere. What is distinctive about the post-Me Too backlash is an expansion of the infrastructural scale and multiplication of the genres of himpathy, which have now become a big part of popular culture. This happens basically on social media platforms like TikTok and YouTube, through influencer podcasts, short-form videos, comedy clips, TikTok reels, and other highly shareable formats that bring millions of men together in networked manospheres. So these are communities, as I said, of massive communities of men, especially young men, that share their anxieties about status and sex, about their grievances and resentment, and about how to become successful and to be a high-value man. At the heart of this platformization of empathy is the idea that men are victims of dispossession, that they are attacked by feminism, not all men, confused by demands to consent, we cannot flirt anymore, pushed out of markets because of equality, which damaged their careers, the EDI programs, as they are known in the Anglo-American language, and humiliated by women who do not choose them as intimate partners. Here, the language of women's rights, one of the languages of pain, the language to consent, the language to choice, is recast as a language of male victimhood. And women ultimately enter those stories less as themselves subjects to harm and more as perpetrators who themselves harm men. So a form of reverse victimization. The displacement of women's pain onto the suffering of male perpetrators in this way turns into a full reversal of positions. The third mechanism by which the far-right backlash blocks the recognition of female victimhood is erasure. Here, the far-right backlash does not only weaponize female victimhood or redirect sympathy towards men, turning women into perpetrators. Erasure works by seeking to minimize or completely delete the female pain from the public sphere itself. Women's suffering is made difficult to name and recognize because the languages through which that suffering is spoken about are either trivialized and delegitimized or stripped away completely. Now, before Me Too, much of what we today recognize as abuse or violence used to fly under the radar of language, of everyday language, of popular culture. Women have, of course, long spoken about their pain, about abuse, coercion, violence, harassment, but these experiences were not cast into widely shared vocabularies of pain and recognition. Their experiences were often spoken about as tragedies, as scandals, or isolated misfortunes, rather than as manifestations of structural vulnerability. Me Too tried to popularize the languages of pain and the demand for recognition. Languages that have long been developed within feminist movements and gender studies scholarship. So through Me Too, sexual harassment, coercion, rape culture, gender-based violence, institutional complicity, survivor testimony entered into wider public conversations and offered many women that shared vocabulary. How does the far-right backlash come to attack those languages then and control how female victimhood is talked about? I talk about two specific forms of erasure here. The first one is what, in my other work on victimhood, the book called Wrong, I call semantic disidentification. We can just call it disidentification, where critical terms like the ones I just mentioned, rape culture, sexual harassment, institutional complicity, etc., are detached from their histories of women's harm and their struggles for recognition and are reframed as excessive, as too much, as ridiculous, as ideological, as manipulative. So patriarchal harm or gender-based violence become ideology. Femicide becomes an activist exaggeration. We don't need it. Transvulnerability becomes gender ideology. Critical race and gender studies become indoctrination. The point here is that the languages of pain and structural injury sound illegitimate or extremist. And the second and final form of erasure that I want to talk about is institutional removal, where any references to gender, race, diversity, structural harm are taken out of official documents of the state and other formal institutional discourse. They're completely wiped away. And a clear example of that is under Elon Musk, Doge in the US. What he did was that he purged all references to diversity, equality, and inclusion. All agencies were pushed to remove DEI materials from their websites, terminate diversity officers and contracts, and search internal systems for programs, grants, or staff marked by the language of race, gender equality, or inclusion. Erasure here is a completely bureaucratic form. It is the liberal state's mechanism not only to wipe out female suffering as a language of recognition, not only female suffering, but also racial suffering, vulnerable group suffering, but to wipe it out as a legitimate object of public knowledge, institutional responsibility, and political demand. Disidentification and institutional removal are ultimately epistemic acts of gender violence. They seek to eliminate the public languages through which gendered suffering can be named and recognized in official discourse. To conclude, Me Too did not recognize all women equally, and its own forms of visibility were shaped by race, class, celebrity, geography, ethnicity, and sexuality. But it did help make women's pain publicly speakable on a new scale. The far-right backlash reacts to this by controlling and suffocating that publicity. Through weaponization, women's suffering is recognized only when it can serve reactionary politics, but silenced when it threatens the powerful. Through displacement, the languages of pain are centered around the suffering of the man who harms. Through erasure, the very languages of pain are degraded, ridiculed, or completely removed from public discourse. My own takeaway from all this, the struggle in this moment of anti-feminist backlash is not only over whether women's pain can be seen in public, but more fundamentally, over who controls the languages through which that pain is made to matter in the first place. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Chouliaraki. I would now like to invite Professor Bannett-Weiser to give us her insights. Professor Bannett-Weiser is Dean of Annenberg School of Communication at the University of Pennsylvania.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. It's such an honor to be here. I appreciate all of you coming out on this warm summer evening. Thank you to the Vice Rector for having us, to Lily for editing this book and making sure that it is something that can be read in Greek. And thank you to the amazing Lisa, who has organized all of us together. I am going to talk a little bit as a kind of the next level after the chapter that we, both Kat Higgins and I contributed to this, to Lily's book. In that chapter, we theorized what we called the digitization of doubt, where one of the most concrete changes brought about by the viral Me Too movement was that it created a new public appetite for stories about sexual violence and sexual harms, an appetite that saw a renewed investment in digital media as a space where women could finally be believed. However, since then, since the kind of initial Me Too movement, that same digital context has become more than simply a backlash to individual women who accuse men of sexual violence. And I want to talk about that digital context today. The digital context has become a fertile space for not only positioning women as liars, as manipulative, right, but also more broadly as casting feminism itself as a lie, a grift, a con. In a moment where authoritarian regimes are posing as democratic nation-states, when we are seeing widespread reversals of rights for women across the globe, when technologies, especially and specifically the digital mediascape, have not only a reach that continues to astound, but also the ability to create new regimes of truth through misinformation, conspiracy theories, and AI, the putative gains of various feminisms over the past several decades have been disavowed by not only conservatives in the extreme right, but by mainstream culture itself. It seems clear that from a glance across all media forms, that in the mid-21st century, gender, more explicitly feminism, has surfaced as a threat, and Lily just very elegantly and eloquently laid out some of the mechanisms of that threat. Feminism is seen as a threat to our children, our schools, our politics, our rights. Feminism, while still the target of far-right rage, has been positioned as a key reason for democratic backsliding in multiple forms. Indeed, anti-gender mobilization is a productive entry point for a range of anti-democratic politics, from eugenics to Christian nationalism to xenophobia to tech power. Part of my question in this larger project, then, is what is the threat of gender equality that requires so much violence to shut it down? What is so dangerous about feminism? And I rely here in part on their recent book, Who's Afraid of Gender, on Judith Butler, who argues that gender has become what they call a phantasm, a target for a range of fears and anxieties and authoritarian aspirations. In their words, for gender to be identified as a threat to all of life, civilization, society, thought, and the like, it has to gather up a wide range of fears and anxieties, no matter how much they contradict one another. It has to package them into a single bundle and subsume them under a single name. So this single bundle of gender, I'm arguing, is circulated in particular ways in the digital landscape, primarily through a heteronormative understanding of femininity, a celebration of marriage between a man and a woman, pronatalism, or having as many babies as possible, and whiteness. So that's the kind of broader context for the digital, some of the digital examples that I'm going to talk about now. A particularly violent meme emerged on the night of the 2024 US presidential election. White nationalist Nick Fuentes posted on Twitter, "Your body, my choice, forever." A sinister play on the feminist slogan, "My body, my choice." This is a violent mirroring of a feminist slogan about bodily autonomy. And after Fuentes posted it, it had been viewed by more than 90 million times and reposted more than 35,000 times. Since that time, since 2024, this kind of mirroring of feminist politics is highly visible, a mirroring that distorts the original meaning of politics as a politics of liberation and equality into one that is seen to be about deception and delusion and lies. So for my analysis, I take inspiration in what Naomi Klein calls a mirror world, where the mirror world is a place where feminism is reflected back in a twisted, distorted way, losing its original meaning and power so that people can use it for things it was never meant for. I use this metaphor to argue that feminists and conservatives are engaging in precisely such a mirror world. Klein argues that in the contemporary political moment, that is driven by digital networks of misinformation and conspiracy theories, there is a mirroring effect on between those on the political left and political right, where feelings of fear and rage and abandonment are shared, even if the origins and realities of that fear and abandonment are different. So this capacious context of the digital allows our various affects, our fears, desires, our rage, our hopes, to travel through the terrain of networked digital media where they are reshaped and redirected, often into radically different political trajectories. As Alan Finlayson argues, contemporary digital media is changing the ways that societal political education happens and how political concepts are understood. So rather than the town hall, the mass meeting, spaces such as this one, rather than television or print media, the spaces through which political ideas, concepts, and arguments are increasingly encountered, articulated, and understood through the digital. It is YouTube, Reddit, TikTok, Facebook, Twitter. Sorry, I refuse to call it X. Twitter. Where we increasingly come to see and do politics. And these digital platforms are the spaces that welcome and encourage political influencers who traffic in misinformation and conspiracy theories, among other things. The media scholar Wendy Chun takes this idea further and writes that the contemporary political and technological landscape is characterized by what she calls the sadistic mirroring of progressive politics. This is a mirroring that is fundamentally about cruelty. So Chun argues that in the current digital climate, she represents what she deems a kind of sadism, arguing that this sadistic culture is focused on demonstration, on showing how reasoning itself is a form of violence. She focuses on how machine learning can be cruel. I want to focus on how reactions and challenges to feminism in the current moment are about this kind of cruelty and sadism, with particular attention to reproductive labor and motherhood. So I'm going to talk about political influencers and tradwives as two sort of subsets of the digital media landscape that kind of engage in these kinds of mirror worlds. One of the most visible platforms that work to drain feminism of its power is the digital world of political influencers, including a subset of tradwives, which I'll get to in a minute. These are influencers who advocate for women to have a traditional kind of lifestyle, a lifestyle that focuses on a particular vision of the ideal family, motherhood, and a commitment to pronatalism. As we've seen more and more in the past 5 years, political influencers are not trivial, not self-important actors to be easily dismissed, regardless of how tempting it is to do just that. They have wielded power in truly impactful ways. The social media influencer class shapes federal policy, right-wing agendas, and have had remarkable sway over a large demographic of global citizens and voters. I can see this in particular in the Trump administration, who uses political influencers and also takes the ideas from political influencers and weaves them into federal policy and law. So these political influencers, along with others, have reinvented feminism, circulating a distorted version of feminist politics across multiple media platforms. Feminism is represented as a series of lies, a con game, a grift. And while feminism has been demonized in many different ways over centuries, there is sort of always already a backlash to feminism. The idea that it is a lie, and not just wrong, or not just a historical relic, seems to me to be a shift in its characterization in the current moment. Feminism in this current moment is contrasted against an idealized heterofemininity, which isn't seen as not just desirable, but it is seen as the truth of us. Feminism, in contrast, is about lies. It represents a scam. One of the things that happened in the United States this year was there was a very highly visible graduation speech that was given by a professional athlete who's very well known, who also has a kind of status as an influencer. So I want to just play a quick clip from a TikTok video that analyzed this so that you can hear some of the speech that he made at graduation.
So this guy gave a speech at a college graduation ceremony and talked about how a woman's true place is in the home.
I think it is you, the women, who have had the most diabolical lies told to you. How many of you are sitting here now about to cross this stage and are thinking about all the promotions and titles you are going to get in your career? Some of you may go on to lead successful careers in the world, but I would venture to guess that the majority of you are most excited about your marriage and the children you will bring into this world. I can tell you that my beautiful wife, Isabel, would be the first to say that her life truly started when she began living her vocation as a wife and as a mother.
The way you...
I'm sure his beautiful wife, Isabel, would say that, right? That's when her life started. The interesting thing about this is, well, two things. One, he said it to a group of women who were graduating from university. So that was his audience for this speech. And second, he talked about feminism as a set of diabolical lies. These aren't any old lies. These are diabolical lies. And so this current climate has become, a rich site for the contestation of, the attacks against feminism. When you listen to or view these attacks, the rage behind them is inescapable. Feminism, again, has always been a threat to the status quo, but the threat feels heightened in this moment, perhaps because there are so many threats to our freedoms, coming at us from so many angles. This rage is often a core element in political influencers, forming part of the architecture of their construction of feminism and its alleged overreach into biology, family, and motherhood. Another political influencer is Candace Owens, who has a podcast with 6 million subscribers. She was asked what the #1 issue in the United States today, and she replied that it was, quote, the attack on the family unit. When she elaborated, she says that the family unit is first as the #1 threat because every other issue follows it. And, quote, feminism is the #1 attack on the family. Feminism is positioned by Owens, Megyn Kelly, and other very highly visible political influencers as the destroyer of not just American values, but global values. In another reel, she was asked about feminism.
You say that people complain so much, but if people didn't complain in those days and fight for people's rights and fight for feminism, which is just equality for women, then you wouldn't be on the stage today and I wouldn't be here asking you this question. So how can you reconcile these differences?
One of the brilliant things that the left does is they repackage words. It's clearly not feminism anymore. It's designed to actually rip apart women and men. Also, I want to just remind you that you don't know true history. And when you wake up to the evils of feminism, they were fixated on breaking up the family. Our society was so much better when women were involved every single day with their children before we handed them over to the Department of Education. And so I do not see feminism as having accomplished anything in our society. I actually think it was a nightmare that is being repackaged in our textbooks.
Again, this was at a university campus where she, makes it clear to the young woman who's asking her the question that she doesn't know true history. In another reel, Owen says, feminism today is a means to demonize men. It has nothing to do with women, actually. It has everything to do with men. It is the practice that women are victims. It is the practice that women can use their victimhood to take down men. There is something extremely wrong with modern feminism and the women who are leading it. And this, again, echoes Lily's important work on victimhood and this idea that men are the ones who are being attacked by feminism. I could go on and on about political influencers. I won't. I'm going to turn very quickly to tradwives as a subset of political influencers. Again, these influencers that I just talked about have followers in the millions. Tradwives is a capacious category. There are many different kinds of tradwives. The ones that I looked at were identified as conservative women, and they were much more ordinary than some media star like Candace Owens. They were, had followers from 1,000 to a couple 100,000. Tradwives, from the portmanteau traditional wife, is an increasingly visible genre of lifestyle influencers on social media. And the women who identify as tradwives send a deceptively simple message. Happiness for women is to be found in caring for and submitting to one's husband, having and raising children, and keeping a tidy and comfortable home. The media representation of tradwives is not new, although it has reached a specific form of political visibility in the current digital mediascape. It seems like the legacy media are putting out articles weekly about tradwives and their followers. Tradwife influencers now have followers in the hundreds of thousands, where they offer their ideas and suggestions about how to get back to traditional gender roles and family dynamics. They have different themes. Different tradwives have different themes, but in the genre of conservative tradwives, they do unify around one particular theme, and that is their vehement hostility towards feminism, often to the point where they blame feminists rather than the patriarchy for numerous breakdowns in society, from the myth of the girl boss to the lack of social care networks to the devaluing of reproductive labor. And so I'm just going to talk for a few minutes before closing about this devaluing of reproductive labor. Tradwives rage again and again against the tendency to devalue and dismiss reproductive labor. For me, when I started watching these, that sounded very familiar. This idea, this critique of how reproduction is devalued in society has been a central tenet of feminist thought. The Wages for Housework movement addressed this very concern through powerful transnational organizing in the 1970s. Feminist theories of social reproduction emphasize this point, arguing that the gendered relationships that are involved in maintaining people, childcare, domestic work, and other forms of invisible labor are key to the continuation of capitalism. But we know that this labor is not valued within capitalism. Indeed, the devaluation of gendered labor solidifies gender divisions of labor and intensifies patriarchal norms. Tradwives, however, selectively draw out some contorted components of this feminist lineage. And here you can see these are some of the early feminist protests about how we don't value reproductive labor. Tradwives draw out these kind of distorted components of feminist lineage while spotlighting the systematic devaluing of women's work in the home. They take, however, a sharp detour from the radical roots of this thinking and instead lean into reductive bioessentialism that makes motherhood a predestined calling for women's true feminine nature. In other words, while historically feminists have sought to denaturalize invisible labor and position it as explicitly political, tradwives seek to not only renaturalize it, but supernaturalize it and position it as a sacred duty. They say it is love. We say it is unwaged work. This was Silvia Federici, a famous Marxist feminist who said these words in 1975. Twisting this notion, tradwives insist that it is both. For tradwives, the degradation of reproductive labor is only solved by elevating motherhood as the only noble and indeed sacred vocation for women. They take a potentially liberating premise. We do need to value reproductive labor It is a problem that it is devalued. But they twist it into a regressive conclusion. Like political influencers, tradwives see feminism as not only the enemy, but a lie. The rage that fueled #MeToo was exhilarating, and it held so much promise, and I still think that it holds promise. However, in the past 10 years, and next year will be its 10th anniversary of the digital movement, that rage has been distorted and redirected into the entrenchment of a regressive patriarchy. What we need to do, I think, and I am echoing the Vice Rector here, that we need to remain vigilant, remain critical, remain engaged in these politics, refuse to let them become mainstream and normalized as a way to insist that feminism is not a lie or a scam, but instead a critically engaged politics. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Bennett Weiser. Professor Gill, she is a professor at Goldsmiths University at the Center for the Study of Global Media and Democracy. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody, for coming out and being here. Huge thanks to the Vice Rector and great esteem for hosting us all. And immense thanks to Lisa Saliki for her incredible work. I mean, really, it's been absolutely phenomenal the way that she's pulled this event together with Lily. And Lily, congratulations. I mean, this is a celebration. It's just so fantastic to be here celebrating this book coming out in the Greek language, the way that you've collected together these articles. You've brought it to a new audience. It's fantastic, and I'm really happy to be here. So it's very echoey, isn't it? I can't get over the sound. I hope, can you hear me okay? Oh, Greek keyboard. Oh, no, I think. Next. Sorry, which one is the next slide one? Or is it? Ah, thank you. Thank you. We've already had an international incident here with the keyboard. So I am going to be talking about a project that I was lucky enough to be part of, which we did in New Zealand, Aotearoa, New Zealand. This project was led by Professor Sue Jackson from the University of Victoria in Wellington, and I've listed all of the other participants on the project. I can see that something a little bit strange has happened to my slides, which was somewhat unanticipated. The font has changed and it looks a little bit different than the way it does on my laptop, but I will persist. So the aim of this project was to ask a very simple question, and that question was, did Me Too make a difference? And the context for the project was really seeing the rise of Me Too media, seeing all the TV series, the films, the public discussions, also the growing visibility of feminist rage and anger. At the same time, the frustration, which Lily has already talked about, around the exclusions of the Me Too #movement in terms of race and class and geopolitical and affective injustices. So those questions about whose stories are being told, whose voices are being heard. And a growing amount of research around feminist flashpoints, lots of work about celebrity disclosures, but there seemed to be little research that actually looked at the experiences of whether Me Too had made a difference in young women's lives. And so we wanted to ask that question, has it actually changed people's understandings, their experiences, their practices in relation to intimate relationships and much else? And we did a study that had various different methods. Just to briefly introduce the participants, we had 91 participants from all over Aotearoa, New Zealand. They were aged between 15 and 25. Some of them were at school, a lot of them were at university or college, and 5 of them were no longer in education. They'd actually moved out of university and into jobs. They were very diverse ethnically and in terms of their national backgrounds. They came from a huge range of countries. Most of them were identifying themselves as cis women, but there were other gender identifications, including cis men, gender fluid, and trans men. And participants also identified with a range of different sexual orientations, including heterosexual, bisexual, pansexual, asexual, and queer. And what we did was a variety of methods. We had focus groups, we did interviews, and we also asked them to bring to their interviews their own media, examples of media that they engaged with, which dealt with issues relevant to sexual harassment. And they were extremely engaged. What we found, I hope this is showing okay because the font is a little strange. What we found, we wrote up in this report, Me Too, A Cultural Shift, which was published last year, and we found that there were, of course, profound gender differences. So everything that Sarah has talked about, Lily has talked about already, around false accusation, around this sort of framing of young men's lives as potentially about to be ruined, this idea of sympathy that Kate Mann talks about, it really resonates with Lily's work, with Kat's work, with Sarah's work. But on the other hand, we found that young women and genderqueer young people were very, very fearful of sexual harassment. And their experiences of sexual harassment had started from childhood and continued onwards. And they were also very angry about the lack of education that they received. They were felt as if they were responsibilized to educate men and boys. And they said that Me Too had meant that sexual harassment was being talked about more, but there had been little actual change. And I just want to talk about 3 particular aspects of a very small subset of our participants. And these were the participants who were predominantly young women who had the most engagement with the issue of Me Too and with sexual harassment, and just specifically talk about how they were feeling. So first of all, they were so striking in the care that they orientated to. So they took a lot of care of each other as activists. That meant that they were very, very concerned about what they shared, whether they would post material that might be upsetting or not, whether they should put a trigger warning on their content if they were posting it. They were also really concerned to post material that was very new, very fresh, that didn't just kind of involve just resharing something that had been shared thousands of times already. And they were very, very orientated to being local as well. They wanted to be locally engaged and not just share and post just, general global, mainly North American material. They were highly engaged around taking care around intersectionality. So they wanted to make sure that their content that they posted on their social media was intersectional, that it wasn't too focused on whiteness. They wanted to make sure that they amplified the most marginalized and subjugated voices. And they also took a really practical kind of care of each other. So they did things like just moderating comments on group posts so that, if horrible comments came in, something really negative, they immediately deleted them because they didn't want their friends to see that or the people that they were involved in activism with. So they were incredibly caring, incredibly considerate, incredibly engaged. And I think that's what makes it all the more painful what they actually experienced, because they came from that kind of orientation. They were extremely angry. They felt angry about sexual harassment. They had experienced all their lives. So Ruth said, "I have been catcalled since the age of 12. That is 10 years of experiencing the ill behavior of men." They talked about being harassed at the beach, on the street, in their schools, on public transport, while they were out socially. They spoke about the fears of having their drinks spiked, of being groped, of being touched up. They spoke about being sexually harassed on their social media. They spoke about being sent images that they hadn't asked for and they didn't want to see. They talked about their bodies being public property and being available for being commented on. And one of the things that was really striking was that rarely did they sound angry. They really were angry, but they didn't sound angry. They weren't shouting, they weren't yelling, there was no ostensible, evident image of anger, but they were angry. And sometimes they would reference that by just quietly saying things like, "I'm one of the 97%. So referring to that statistic, that well-known statistic about what percentage of young women has been harassed. So they were showing that they knew how prevalent sexual harassment was, but they didn't necessarily have to describe their particular experiences. They'd been physically attacked, and at least one of our participants had been raped. They also were angry about the failure of their own educational institutions to do anything about this. So no time to prepare them for what was a ubiquitous experience. They deployed heavy sarcasm when talking about the kinds of internet safety training or self-defense or safety training that they'd received in their schools. Most of it was centered on them policing their behavior. And they were told to get things like a knife hidden in a lipstick or a taser hairbrush as means of self-defense. And again, I would like to reference Kat and Sarah's book on believability, which has just so many great examples of these kinds of technologies that are marketed to women. As well as being angry about their sexual harassment, the lack of education, they were also angry about the reactions to their anger. So they felt very, very angry that they were trying to do something about sexual harassment as an issue. They were really engaged, but they felt that they were dismissed, they were disparaged, they weren't listened to, they weren't believed, they weren't taken seriously. And one of the young women who was still at school said there was going to be an assembly at school around sexual harassment, and she said, "I actually asked a young male friend to do it because I knew that if he said it, even if he used the exact script that I was going to, his words would be taken more seriously." They said things like, "We get shut down, we get taken down, we get lied to about being taken down. It's not through lack of trying, it's from a lack of power and a lack of respect." They were angry about being attacked, about being trolled, about being slandered, for trying to raise the issue of sexual harassment. And for some of the participants who identified as heterosexual, they also felt that there was a particular penalty that they suffered in terms of calling out sexual harassment. One thing that was really striking was their anger about what they referred to as performative activism. So it was very striking that it became a topic of conversation, that they talked about the appropriation of their ideas and how in a particular moment it had somehow become cool or trendy to identify as a feminist, and people who hadn't been involved, hadn't been doing anything, were in no way active, trying to claim that identity. And one of the participants said, I think what hurts the most is when people say they're on your side and then they're a completely different person when they turn their back on you. And this young person, Eden, gave the example of basically having a conversation with some boys in her class when she was in school and telling them how upsetting it was to be subject to sexualizing comments, and the boys just saying, oh yeah, we get it, no, we're on your side, we've got your back. And then immediately that they turned away, they started having these, vulgar conversations about who's the most fuckable, who's the hottest, and Eden's saying, but that's exactly what we were talking about. You just don't get it, but you said you did. The other thing I wanted to talk about, the last set of experiences, is around the other things that they felt besides rage, because I feel as if there's been a lot of talk in contemporary feminism, quite rightly and quite understandably, about anger and rage and feminist rage. But what we found was that very, very often anger was tangled up with a range of other different feelings. So there was a lot of shame, as you might imagine, shame and embarrassment and blaming of the self, and maybe I brought it on myself. There was a huge amount of pain, just real pain, distress, hurt, upset. There was a lot of vulnerability and trauma, genuine trauma in the way that they talked about experiencing things. And I'll quote some of their words in a moment, which are quite upsetting. Some of them felt really depressed. Some of them felt really quite despairing. They felt like they'd been fighting this, they'd been contesting this, they'd been trying to make a positive difference in the world, and they sometimes could spiral down. They also talked about how fearful they were and how much terror there was. And of course, like most activists, they talked about their exhaustion and just how overwhelming it is to be, particularly online, doing your activism and being overwhelmed by all of the stuff that's coming at you the whole time, some of it really, really hard stuff, and how easy it was to get burnt out. So I just wanted to raise those things because I think that it's really important that we put them into conversation with anger, and we don't somehow just lift anger out and treat it as if it's either the purest feminist emotion or the only thing going on. And here are Callie, Maria, and Ava in their own words. So Callie said, mental health TikTok can get very dark. And she spoke about her very, very traumatized reaction to reading someone's account of non-consensual choking. And Maria also talked about sexual harassment, a case that had really featured prominently in the local media. And she said, it made me feel gross, like so sick. And I can't consume any more of those stories. It's just so harrowing to me. And Ava said, I get so exhausted sometimes, I have to actually put my phone down for a few days. Like some days I cannot handle it. Like I just get, I think she says, overwhelmed there. So to conclude, our young women and young genderqueer participants felt angry that they were growing up in a world where they experienced so much sexual harassment despite Me Too. They also felt angry at the reactions that greeted their attempts to make a difference. But alongside their anger, there were many, many other emotions that coexisted and were entangled with that anger. And I think it's really important to recognize those as well as part of the conversation. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Gill. Professor Higgins, also from the Goldsmiths University, from the Department of Communication and Cultural Studies, will now have the floor for another 15 minutes.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to the Vice Rector for having us. Thank you to Lisa for organizing. And of course, massive congratulations to Lily on this fantastic volume that I'm so thrilled to be part of. I'd like to start today by talking about E. Jean Carroll. Now, as many of you probably know and remember, E. Jean Carroll is an American writer who accused now President Donald Trump of sexually assaulting her in the changing room of a department store in the mid-1990s. Due to a sort of temporary suspension of the statute of limitations in the state of New York, E. Jean Carroll was able to bring her allegations against President Trump in a civil court in 2023, and eventually that court found that on the balance of available evidence, the allegations made by Carroll against Trump were more likely to be true than false. And outside the courtroom, celebrating this decision, Carroll said to waiting reporters, "Now the world knows the truth." And it's starting from the mutability of that word truth and the difficulty that both I and my co-author Sarah this difficulty we had sharing that sense of optimism that I want to open the talk today. So obviously, Carroll's case is just one amongst many, one of many cases in which credible accusations of sexual violence have been leveled, ample evidence has existed, and yet denial has often persisted. And one of the questions that I found myself asking, and that I know Sarah also found herself asking at the time, was what kind of truth was Carroll referring to when she made this comment? And whom among us who did not know it before the trial could truly say that we knew it afterwards? Fast forward to today, however, and my questions are slightly different. And I hope that you'll bear with me that today's talk is mostly a talk about the questions that are haunting my work rather than the answers that I've come up to for those questions. So last week, as many of you may have seen, Trump ordered the US Department of Justice to open a criminal investigation into E. Jean Carroll. Her alleged crime: perjury, lying, being an unbelievable subject in a world that has allocated her more belief than she is due. In our contribution to this volume that Lily has edited, Sarah and I argue that public spectacles such as trials like this are often designed to discredit women's testimonies of sexual violence. Another notable example of this, of course, is the hypermediated Depp Heard trial. And they're more designed to exonerate people in the court of public opinion than they are to work for legal exoneration. They're about cultural absolution rather than legal impunity. By reintroducing doubt into the narrative, accused men are able to relegate women's testimonies of violence to the status of less than fact, ensuring that the gendered and racialized economy of believability that we theorize in our book is able to continue working in their favor. Indeed, even though our analysis in the book is broadly pessimistic about what Me Too has and has not done for feminism, and you'll probably get a sense in this talk that I'm broadly a feminist, one of our key concessions was that in the aftermath of the viral hashtag version of Me Too, at least white men of power and privilege were expected to undertake some believability labor, some of the work of becoming believable in public culture, in ways that we thought were historically unprecedented, even if enduringly uneven. But reading the news of Trump's latest act of aggression towards Carroll, I struggle to view it in these terms that Sarah and I laid out in our book, which we wrote now 5 or 6 years ago. I do not think that what Trump is doing here is laboring for belief. Truly, it appears too effortless to be called labor. And if I'm honest with myself, the believability of Carol's accusations against Trump appear to have been too inconsequential to be worth laboring against. As I said, a civil court ruled in Carol's favor in this case twice, actually, because there was a defamation hearing, but it did not matter. Trump was reelected as president, including by a majority of white women. He was also found guilty of 37 felony charges. That didn't seem to matter very much either. So in the book, Sarah and I make this argument that that these debates about the truthfulness of women's speech and women's testimonies are often used as a ruse to disguise a much more profound lack of care for what those truths have to tell us about the world and the place of women within it. Trump's return to power undoubtedly helps affirm that thesis. He no longer needs to work for believability because he has been assured by the voting public that they do not care enough about the women that he harmed for the believability of those women to matter. Carol may have won, but Trump certainly did not lose. So what then is going on here, if not a struggle for believability? To understand it, I think we need to place it in a much wider context. Since Sarah and I finished writing our book, the primary focus of my work has become the cultural strategies and repertoires of far-right political movements around the world, including, but not limited to, the MAGA movement in the United States. Of particular interest to me within this work is the contradictory way that these movements position themselves vis-a-vis the power of the state, and particularly vis-a-vis the power of the criminal justice system to regulate, to discipline, and to punish. Indeed, it's this idea of criminal legal vulnerability, specifically, that has become a cornerstone of the mythology of Trump himself as a victimized subject. This is a label that he routinely claims. And of course, the most recent sort of beat in this mythology was the announcement of a $1.7 billion anti-weaponization fund in the United States designed to support those who have been victimized by the American criminal legal system. Of course, and I'm sure I'm not telling any of you something that you don't already know, this is not really how the vulnerability politics of the criminal legal system is organized at all. As feminist scholars like Lisa Marie Katcho, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and Angela Davis have long documented, the criminal legal system has a pronounced gender and racial politics that specifically privileges whiteness and subjects certain populations, including women, to organized forms of violence and abandonment. In the United Kingdom, where I live and work, the prosecution rate for rape is somewhere between 1% and 2%. This is hardly a crisis of legal persecution against men. Thus, this discourse of legal vulnerability provokes two questions in me simultaneously. The first, of course, is how it is possible to weaponize something that already functions very effectively as a weapon, including against society's most vulnerable groups and including against women. But the second question is that I wonder whether the problem perhaps is not the system's capacity for violence, but rather who it is that that violence might now be able to target. There is a fear, in other words, of vulnerability itself, vulnerability to the perceived possibility of a future in which the law may begin to treat powerful, wealthy men like Trump in the way that it treats women and people of color almost routinely. It's a political complaint, but not about where we are, but rather about where we might be going. Over the last few years, I've come to describe this as a politics of victimhood. Unlike victimhood, which Lily has rigorously theorized in her work, which pairs public spectacles of suffering with claims to injustice, victimhood locates the injury that defines a victim as a victim in a version of the future that has not yet and may indeed never arrive. Victimhood has always played a role in the sort of misogynistic and anti-feminist backlashes to the Me Too movement, with countless men, and yes, some women, asserting that the very possibility of an innocent man being falsely accused of sexual assault and then disbelieved and then charged and then prosecuted, which we have to keep in mind is statistically speaking a minute possibility, the possibility of that itself was enough to qualify men and boys as emerging victims of feminism. Since then, however, the significance of victimhood in anti-feminist politics has only increased. Public discourse and media is saturated with anxious discourses about the crisis of masculinity, about how young men are falling behind in society, about the disadvantages that men still face or may face in the future if we continue to gear ourselves towards social and economic justice. And still, this discourse of men's unacceptable vulnerability to a criminal legal system that in a hypothetical future, not a future we are presently in, could stop treating the things that women say about their lives with routine suspicion and skepticism and inaction. So what becomes of believability under these sorts of conditions? When the things that we're being asked to believe in are not the facts that comprise our political past, but the possible shapes of our collective political future. This is an ongoing question for me and a question that I continue to wrestle with. But in the wrestling that I've done so far, there seem to be at least two key developments that I think we need to be cognizant of and that warrant our attention both as scholars and as feminists. The first is that there seems to be a new kind of conjuncture emerging. If the post-Me Too conjuncture is, or was, as Sarah and I described it, one characterized by anxiety, heated public anxiety about how facts are known and mediated on the one hand, and then a backlash against women's truth-telling in public on the other hand, what confronts us now is a remarkably different collision of forces. Where we used to have obfuscation, denial, and concealment, we are now witnessing a much more attention-seeking mode of cruelty, in which violence is not hidden, but rather embraced in the form of grotesque public spectacle. And this connects with Wendy Chun's work on sadism that Sarah already mentioned. To me, this is the only convincing reading of what's happening with the latest beat in Trump's attack on Carol. It's not an attempt to silence her and to rebalance the politics of believability in his favor, because that politics already operates in his favor. It is a gratifying theater of punishment, designed to elicit the emotions and affects of justice without asking serious questions about what justice requires. You cannot unmask what is already unmasked. You cannot reveal what is already known. And today, the violence of patriarchy has determined that the safest place for it to hide is in plain sight, indeed, in a spotlight. Truth-telling as a political practice becomes impotent under these conditions. And then alongside this new spectacular politics of cruelty, the dynamics of post-truth culture have also changed. If 10 years ago we were preoccupied anxiously with how and whether and when things could be determined as factual or as real, in the present day that anxiety has given way to a broad sense of epistemic nihilism, in which the imperative of the real has been strategically displaced in the way that we communicate with each other about politics. Media has become impressionistic rather than expository. As Claire Wilmot writes of the far right's growing use of generative AI online, and I've put some examples of that up for you here, emotional and ideological authenticity now fully dominate questions of empirical authenticity in public culture. And far-right actors regularly marvel at how much more real a fake image can seem to their experience of the world, be that the present world or the world they imagine coming, how much more real something that is officially fake can feel than a photograph. So this collision of epistemic nihilism, of a spectacular politics of cruelty, and of an anxious preoccupation with the could-be shape of the future poses unique challenges for progressive politics in general, and I argue for feminism in particular. We cannot debunk media that is self-consciously and obviously fake. We cannot fact-check a future that is not yet here. And we cannot reveal what already exists in plain sight. At a workshop that I attended at Goldsmiths last week, the Spanish media scholar Maria Jose Gámez Fuentes posed the following question to feminists. What would happen if we stopped trying to become believable and just started to become impossible? I fear that the anti-feminist forces that surround us have already answered that question for themselves. So, what can we do? Back in the early 2020s, when Sarah and I were writing this book, which seemed an awfully long time ago now, we argued that believability had two definitions. First, the capability of being believed, and second, the quality of being convincing. But when believability as a concept is applied to the imaginary future rather than the factual present, it takes on a third meaning. This is one based on the idea of belief not as fact, but as faith, belief as a register of hope. The fatalistic dystopias and apocalyptic utopias of the far-right movement now saturate our media environment. Their visions of the future surround us on all sides. But hope, too, is a form of future-orientated imagination. As feminist theorists like Naomi Klein and Wendy Brown have argued, I can think of no more effective basis for a broad coalition progressive politics in the current moment than a commitment to the idea of the future and the idea that the future can still be chosen and changed. Our imagination must exceed our reality because imagination is a precursor for reality. If belief marks the point that we suspend doubt, then a key task for feminist media and feminist media scholars is to help us suspend doubt in the possibility of a future that is better, not worse, than the present. I don't think that I've quite figured out how to do that yet, but I know that we all do, and so I'm very grateful to be here with you all, grateful for this volume, and grateful to be in conversation with all these brilliant feminist colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Higgins. Now, Professor Tsaliki, who is also president of the Department of Communication and Media at the University of Athens, will give her insights about the Greek context.
Thank you. Dear Madam Vice Rector, dear friends and co-panelists, dear colleagues and students, dear all, I'm going to be talking today about feminist voice, from feminist voice to moral training, confidence, character, and aging in post-Me Too Greece. So, in this talk, I want to revisit the Greek Me Too movement, not to question the legitimacy or political force, its legitimacy or political force, but to complicate how we understand its cultural afterlife. To do this, I will draw from my work on confidence culture in Greece, featured in Lily's volume, as well as from my latest work around aging femininity, featuring aging celebrity femininity in Greece, and expanding now into collaborative work with Dimitris Thomakos from the Department of Business Administration here at the University of Athens. This part of my work is heavily invested in the scholarship of Sarah Bennett-Weiser and Rosalind Gill, so you may appreciate the scholarly exhilaration I feel being in their presence. In Greece, Me Too was widely celebrated as a feminist rupture, a moment that finally gave voice to silence experiences of sexual violence, especially in elite cultural and sporting fields. This celebration matters, but today I want to raise alongside a more troubling question. What kinds of feminist subjects, responsibilities, and moral expectations did Me Too help consolidate in Greece? My argument is that the Greek Me Too did not unfold outside neoliberalism. Rather, it was deeply entangled with a culture of confidence, resilience, and crucially, character. In this context, feminist critique increasingly became folded into individualized logics of self-management, emotional discipline, and behavioral reform. So let me elaborate. Post-Me Too public discourse in Greece repeatedly emphasized speaking out, healing, and empowerment, not as collective political struggles, but as personal achievements. Women were encouraged not only to tell their stories, but to tell them well, calmly, articulately, and with optimism. In lifestyle media, cultural journalism, and social media feminism, empowerment was reframed as a demonstration of psychological strength. Survivors were expected to be resilient, positive, forward-looking. At the same time, structural violence faded into the background, while emotional comportment moved to the foreground. This is not simply an affective shift, What we see instead is the emergence of a more authoritative framework, a framework that treats confidence, resilience, courage, and emotional intelligence as moral virtues. Drawing on Ball, Ecclestone, and feminist critiques of the likes of Sarah Bennett-Weiser, Ross Gill, and Angela McRobbie, who address such issues of emotional governance, I suggest that post-Me Too Greece participates in an emerging epistemological community of lifelong character education. And by lifelong character education, I refer to a continuous process through which subjects are encouraged to cultivate and display morally valued dispositions like resilience, positivity, confidence, in ways aligned with neoliberal forms of self-governance. Here, feminism converges with a conservative, some would even say neo-Victorian, if we were in the UK, neoliberal revival of character building, rearticulated through contemporary psychological, therapeutic, and educational vocabularies. My own analysis of confidence culture in Greece draws on a systematic, discursive, and thematic study of 400 articles published between 2017 and 2022 in Greek women's magazines, lifestyle platforms, and cultural journalism. Three discursive axes dominate. First, we see an advice continuum that normalizes constant self-improvement. After high-profile Me Too testimonies, especially by women actors and athletes, articles quickly shift from power and abuse to lessons on transforming pain into strength or on coming back stronger. Second, we see celebrity narratives operate as moral templates. Celebrity confessions rarely dwell in anger or demand justice. Instead, they emphasize therapy, gratitude, optimism, and self-work. Celebrity culture thus becomes an informal curriculum of character formation. Third, we see a persistent psychologization of structural harm. Sexism, precarity, and inequality are reframed as challenges to be managed emotionally. Resilience, then, becomes a regulatory ideal, originally demanded during austerity governance and later normalized through popular culture as a moral obligation. Failure to bounce back risks being read not as injustice upon social subjects, but as an emotional deficiency of the individual woman. So who exactly is empowered? Because I'm arguing that this framework of empowerment is deeply exclusionary. The feminist subject celebrated in post-Me Too Greece is overwhelmingly white, middle-class, cisgender, able-bodied, and emotionally articulate. Working-class women, migrant and refugee women, trans subjects, older women, racialized women appear rarely, if at all, and when they do, they are framed through exceptionalism rather than structural critique. Empowerment, in this sense, becomes conditional. It depends not only on speaking, but on speaking in the right way, with the right effect, and from the right positionality. Confidence, composure, and moral seriousness become conditions of feminist legibility. At this point, let me extend the argument by bringing aging into the frame. In contemporary Greek culture, the exigency for confidence and resilience does not fade with age. Instead, it intensifies. Drawing on my work in Australia last year on aging celebrity femininity in Greece, I argued that this occurs through the powerful liberal trope of aging well, where you're expected to grow older without aging. Women are coached to take proactive responsibility for aging bodies and futures through fitness, diet, beautification technologies, and constant self-surveillance. This way, aging becomes a site of entrepreneurial labor, risk management, and moral accountability. I see this as a form of new prudentialism, which I take to be distinct from the prudentialism originally argued by Miller and Rose in the context of shifting security politics and the death of the social. In the contemporary gendered context, instead of exhibiting prudence through financial planning via private pensions and insurance, women need to perform this new prudentialism by taking cautionary measures against the aesthetic, social, and economic cause of poor aging. And again, with new prudentialism, I refer to a gendered regime of risk management in which women are expected to anticipate and mitigate the aesthetic, social, and economic costs of aging through ongoing bodily and emotional labor. This is guided by advice disseminated through various technologies of consumption, advertising, market research, niche marketing, and so on, which strategically amplify age-related anxieties and guilt. In doing so, they cultivate a lucrative industry of risk, meticulously organized around women's appearance and perceived attractability. The resulting politics of risk dictates that women must assume full personal responsibility for managing the hazards associated with aging. Failure to invest adequately in appearance and composure, mitigating these risks, becomes a personal fault. Thus, investing in security through the aforementioned technologies of beautification is incorporated into the duties of the responsible, active woman. To neglect this investment is to risk having failed to preemptively guard against future bodily decay. To this goal, media and celebrity culture function as pedagogies of aging, establishing narrow forms of acceptable femininity. The aging woman must remain youthful but not ridiculous, attractive but not desperate, confident but not demanding. Here, character education and aging well converge. Confidence is no longer optional, it becomes a lifelong moral requirement. So why Greece matters? I make the argument that the Greek case sharpens this analysis. Greece is one of the fastest aging countries in Europe. By 2050, over 35% of the population will be over 65. Women significantly outlive men and will constitute a growing demographic majority. Yet cultural power, visibility, and authority remain deeply and unequally distributed. This makes the governance of aging femininity a seriously understudied subject, both urgent and timely. Leadership and decision-making offers a particularly revealing side when it comes to aging femininity. For women over 45 in senior or aspiring leadership and decision-making positions, confidence is not merely desirable, it is structurally demanded. Authority must be paired with aesthetic discipline. Experience must be accompanied by emotional intelligence. Visibility must be carefully managed. Aging femininity in leadership and decision-making thus becomes a life course regime of character governance, where confidence signals moral fitness for power. The body, face, hair, dress function as evidence of continued legitimacy. What happens when women fail, resist, or opt out of these scripts remain a critical question, which I am to address in the upcoming research quest. So, to conclude, my aim today has not been to dismiss Me Too's political significance. Me Too in Greece opened crucial space for feminist debate and public testimony, but at the same time, it participated in the normalization of a neoliberal, post-feminist model of citizenship, one in which empowerment is recorded as emotional discipline, resilience as a moral duty, and confidence as a lifelong obligation. By foregrounding character education and aging, we can see that contemporary feminism is not only about voice and visibility, it is also about what kinds of subjects are rewarded, which lives are rendered intelligible, and how responsibility is redistributed onto women's bodies and selves across the life course. So the question is not only who gets to speak, but who is allowed to age, to struggle, and to remain credible without performing confidence as a moral virtue. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Tsaliki, and all of the speakers for your very interesting and topical contributions. Let me begin by saying why this event and this book are so valuable. Me Too has often been described as a moment of voice. The work that we discuss today, though, asks us to move beyond this first necessary formulation. It asks not only what Me Too made visible, but how visibility is mediated, who speaks and who is heard, what counts as testimony and what becomes credible, what feminism gained after Me Too, but also, and certainly most importantly, what forms of backlash, exhaustion, appropriation, and exclusion emerged in its aftermath. This is where the volume makes a decisive contribution. The public discussion on Me Too has been intense and politically significant, but the role of the media in shaping that discussion has not been sufficiently examined. The book addresses precisely this gap. It treats Me Too as a mediated public event, something which is produced, circulated, amplified, contested, and transformed through journalism, television, social media, platform infrastructures, and so on. The Greek case is especially revealing. Me Too in Greece did not unfold in a vacuum. It emerged in a society marked by the legacies of austerity, persistent gender inequalities, fragile trust in institutions, and low interpersonal trust, intense media personalization, and a public sphere in which questions of morality, family, respectability, and credibility are deeply entangled. To examine Me Too in Greece helps us to reconfigure the public discourse around violence, power, authority, and democracy. This is also why it is politically and intellectually crucial that this book appears in Greece and in Greek. The translation here is an intervention in the public sphere. It makes available in our own language concepts and critical tools urgently needed in a country where patriarchy remains deeply rooted. From working-class environments to universities, which we often celebrate as spaces of free circulation of ideas, while too often failing to confront their own gender hierarchies, silences, stereotypes, and exclusions. Gender stereotypes, discrimination, diffuse misogyny, and toxic masculinity cut horizontally across Greek society. They are not confined to one ideological family, one class, or one institutional field. They traverse citizens and political actors across the entire political spectrum. Against the background of persistent domestic violence, coercive and controlling behaviors, and what can only be described as an epidemic of femicides, only last week we've had 2 of them, a volume on Me Too and the media offers more than an academic contribution. For this reason, I would like to warmly congratulate all of the contributors to the volume. I will not have the time today to comment on all of the excellent chapters it contains, but I want to acknowledge the collective significance of the work. The book opens a much-needed conversation about the media mediations of Me Too at a moment when such a conversation is democratically urgent. I would like to organize my reflections around 5 analytical contributions emerging from the presentations we discussed today. The first is the shift from moral panic to the political analysis. Rosalind Gill and Shani Orgad remind us that the earlier debates were often framed through the language of sexualization of culture. The post-Me Too shift, though, is a shift toward sex and power. It moves feminist debate from moral regulation to the political critique. Moving away from the exposure of bodies, the concern is about coercion, hierarchy, consent, institutional complicity, and justice. At the same time, we cannot romanticize Me Too. The movement created new solidarities and public spaces for testimony, but it also reproduced exclusions. The figure of the believable survivor has often been white, Western, secular, cisgender, able-bodied, middle-class, professional, and media visible. Other subjects, like queer survivors, disabled women, migrant women, working-class women, women in domestic or precarious labor, and women whose respectability is already socially contested, have often remained marginal. Gill's recent empirical work adds a crucial correction to triumphalist accounts of visibility. Me Too has started a conversation about sexual harassment, which remains unfinished and becomes increasingly polarized. Young women, we saw it, and genderqueer participants describe harassment as a ubiquitous experience from childhood onwards. They also describe institutional failure, poor education, and the expectation that women themselves should educate men and boys. This brings affect into our analysis. Anger is present and politically important, but it is not the only feminist emotion. It is entangled with care, with shame, fear, anxiety, trauma, vulnerability, exhaustion, and burnout. Feminist politics cannot be built only around the visibility of range. They must also attend to the emotional labor and depletion that accompany activism. The second contribution concerns the three mechanisms that Lili Kouliaraki theorized. The mechanism of weaponization of anti-feminism, displacement mechanism, which is the reverse victimization, where the language of women's rights becomes a language of male injury, and women become the perpetrators who harm men. And the third mechanism, erasure, which seeks to minimize or even delete the female pain from the public sphere. We see this through gender-based violence, which, as Professor Kouliaraki said, becomes ideology, femicides seen as activist exaggeration, and the institutional removal of the term, this refusal to acknowledge the phenomenon as such. Those mechanisms move us beyond the simple question of the real versus the fake victims, and it asks who claims the victimhood, from which social position, through which media infrastructures, with what resources, and with what consequences. Catherine Higgins sharpens this problem through the question of believability in what she calls a mask of times. After Me Too, the issue is not only whether survivors speak, but whether they become believable within institutions and publics structured by inequality. Vulnerable and impoverished populations are often treated as targets of regulation, discipline, and punishment, but not as subjects worthy of protection. They are objects of law, not its authors or addressees. The politics of victimhood is here so suggestive. It directs us to the conditionality of recognition. In the age of the backlash, the language of injury has been appropriated by powerful actors. Men accused of harassment present themselves as victims of false accusations. Conservative publics present themselves as victims of feminism. Anti-gender actors present themselves as victims of political correctness and gender ideology. Majorities present themselves as victims of minorities. Instead of rejecting vulnerability, contemporary backlash redistributes it. It takes the moral authority historically attached to injury and attaches it to dominant groups. For feminist politics, the task is not to dismiss suffering, it is to contextualize it. Not all claims to injury have the same relation to power. Not all wounds are structurally equivalent. Not all vulnerability challenges domination. Some claims to vulnerability even reproduce it. The third contribution concerns the digital media and the transformation of backlash. Sarah Bannett-Weiser's presentation showed that after Me Too, digital media created publics where women's testimonies could circulate and be believed, but also spaces where women could be called liars, manipulative, untrustworthy, or opportunistic. What we see now is even broader. Doubt no longer targets only individual women who accuse men of sexual violence, it targets feminism as such. Feminism is represented as a lie, a grift, a deception, a conspiracy, a force that has manipulated women and made them unhappy. This is a digital struggle over whether feminism remains believable as a diagnosis of power. The figure of the trad wife is especially revealing. Trad wife culture does not simply reject feminism, but it offers an alternative moral universe. It says, feminists lie to you, emancipation has exhausted you, equality made you lonely, work culture exploited you, and modern life made you miserable. It then offers retreat as salvation. Heterosexual marriage, motherhood, domesticity, submission, spirituality, and always a mythic past. The strength of your analysis is that you do not miss the grievances that are mobilized by the trad wife culture as fabricated. Trad wives and feminists often respond to the same crisis: burnout, the devaluation of care, the failures of social reproduction, and the absence of collective support for mothers and families. But they politicize this crisis and those grievances in opposite directions. Feminism points towards structural transformation, whereas tradwife culture points toward individualized retreat. The fourth contribution comes from Lisa Tsalikis' presentation on post-culture Me Too, post-Me Too in Greece, with the confidence culture, the character, aging, and moral training. This intervention brings the discussion directly into the Greek context and asks what kinds of feminist subjects Me Too helped consolidate. Tsaliki argues that Greek Me Too did not unfold outside neoliberalism. The act of speaking out was often framed as personal achievement. The desirable feminist subject became confident, resilient, emotionally disciplined, courageous, composed, and morally serious. Empowerment was reframed as psychological strength, and structural violence receded behind narratives of self-governance. This is a crucial point. Post-Me Too feminism can be incorporated into a broader culture of confidence, resilience, and character building. The woman who speaks is expected not only to testify, but to perform strength, and feminist voice becomes attached to moral fitness. I also found the dimension of aging especially original, and your perspective on this. Aging femininity becomes a regime of moral governance, and I think this is a very, very interesting insight that you gave us. And the fifth contribution concerns the feminist future. Taken together, those interventions show that the post-Me Too movement is neither simply progress nor simply backlash. It is an unstable terrain, an unformed terrain, in which feminist visibility expands, but is also commodified. Testimony becomes audible, but in a very uneven way. And vulnerability becomes public, but also appropriable. This is precisely the value of your insights in this book. You give us the tools to understand Me Too in a mediated struggle over public meaning. The book asks how media shape the conditions under which sexual violence becomes speakable, intelligible, credible, and actionable. It asks how platforms amplify feminist testimony, but also anti-feminist doubt. How television, journalism, and social media produce certain survivors as recognizable and others as marginal. It asks how the public discourse travels from global to the local, and how the women's voice is heard between countries and continents as well. So from a political scientist perspective, I would draw four quick, broad implications. First, Me Too is a politics of voice, but voice is not enough, as we have seen. Voice requires infrastructures of recognition, institutions that can listen, media that can contextualize, publics that can sustain attention, and procedures that can transform testimony into accountability. Second, believability is political. It is produced through classed, racialized, gendered, sexualized, and institutional hierarchies. A feminist politics after Me Too must also ask who is granted the possibility of being heard as truthful. Third, the backlash is not merely a reaction. It produces counter-publics, alternative truth regimes, moral panics, affective identities, and political entrepreneurs. It does not only silence feminism, but it seeks to redefine feminism as a source of harm and permanent threat. Fourth, this discussion is also central to our broader research agenda on gender, democracy, and extremism. Contemporary anti-feminist backlash should be understood through the nexus between masculinism and insecurity. Feelings of fear, resentment, loss of control, and perceived status decline do not automatically produce extremist or anti-democratic politics. They become politically consequential when they are organized through masculinist narratives, leadership styles, media, infrastructures, and institutional practices. This is where gender becomes central to democracy, not as a secondary cultural issue, but as a terrain where insecurity is interpreted, weaponized, and converted into support for reactionary, identitarian, and authoritarian politics. A democratic feminist response must therefore move beyond simple denunciation. It must also identify the practices of resistance and repair, the forms of leadership, the policies, the media practices, and the institutional culture that can counter the emotional appeal of masculinist backlash and rebuild trust in democratic equality. I would now like to open the discussion by posing a few questions to our panel. I have one question for all of you, and then I have two questions for the whole panel. So, Professor Chouliaraki, I would like to hear your thoughts about how we can distinguish in public debate between the systemic vulnerability and the tactical victimhood without reproducing the hierarchies of the worthy and the unworthy victims, and what kinds of institutions and public vocabularies could help us to do this?
Thank you. Thank you. First of all, thank you for your reflections, Lambrini. I think they were spot on and very eloquent and very to the point. So that was admirable, I must say, after 5 presentations. I don't know if I have the, the kind of breadth of knowledge to address both dimensions of your question, especially regarding the institutional infrastructures that might be able to support the kind of politics that you just mentioned. But in terms of the first dimension of your project, how can we talk about victims in a society that's already marked by sedimentation and hierarchies without reproducing those? I would say, well, what in my book, Wronged, I call the kind of the heuristics of victimhood. I think we need to start asking the right questions. And so far, when we are confronted with claims to victimhood in the public sphere, for instance, in the context of Me Too, I think we are stuck in a kind of epistemological battle between, who speaks the truth and who is misleading, who is manipulating, where does the truth lie? And what I'm trying to say is that the question of truth, and that's something that's so eloquently and rigorously also being put forward by Sarah's and Kat's book, Believability, is that the question of truth itself is political. And so what we need to do is shift the terms of the questions that we ask. So that instead of asking, is this true? Is she faking? Or questions around kind of that sphere of understanding, I would ask by addressing directly the power relations that inform that debate in the first place. And I think once we go into asking about, as you just mentioned earlier, who is speaking, from which context, what are the power relations of that particular situated encounter, what are the broader power relations and ideologies that inform that context. I think what we are doing is that we are also kind of creating a second understanding of how those who speak and those that support them are positioned within a broader field of power, an intersectional field of power. So that, for instance, of course women can speak out, as you said, and have a voice, but who is the particular woman who speaks? Where is she positioned within that kind of broader spectrum of social relations? Mm-hmm. In terms of class, poor Black women in particular are incredibly marginalized in public debates. And so they are not going to be believed. They're not even going to be having access to the media that would enable their voice to be heard. And so we can create, so to speak, understandings, new maps of the power relations involved, in particular claims to victimhood, and then read truth also through the prism of who speaks, in what context, and how that might filter or shape the way their talk is perceived.
Thank you very much.
If I may say one more thing in terms of the second part of the question, I think that kind of awareness and that kind of understanding of how intersectional conceptions of voice and subjectivity can inform institutions like the media, asking the right kinds of questions and asking the right kinds of, providing the right kind of frames. I think that might be one way into giving voice, if you like, to those who don't have it and avoiding the reproduction of hierarchies.
Thank you. To Professor Bennett Weiser and Professor Higgins, because you had similar themes. So if digital backlash has moved from doubting women to doubting feminism itself, how can feminist politics rebuild this believability? What does it mean to reclaim the feminist future in the mask of times?
Thank you for that. Sorry, I'm writing this down so I don't forget. Thank you for that incredible summary, too. That was really comprehensive and wonderful. So the question is, how do feminist politics move beyond believability, or the economy of believability, and what are our feminist futures? And it's to both Kat and I.
Exactly.
So I think that I'm gonna, since I'm speaking first, I'm gonna talk about feminist futures, and you could talk about how we moved beyond doubt. Is that good? Okay. I think that this is, the idea of what is a feminist future is absolutely crucial, I think, to all of our work. We all kind of gesture towards it or directly referenced it in some way in these presentations. I'm a college professor. I teach undergraduates every year. They are concerned about feminist futures in a kind of conjunctural moment, a global conjunctural moment where it seems the future seems so precarious and it seems so kind of out of reach in terms that we understand. I think a feminist future has never been more important. Tradwives, I've written about tradwives and their understanding of futures. They understand, they literally have said the future is the past. Their interest in the future is to actually go back to a nostalgic time, which, as with all nostalgia, never actually existed. And if it did exist for any, it existed for the very privileged white middle and upper class women who could afford to stay home with their children, and have a one-income family. But they're incredibly depressing in the sense that their understanding of future is the past. So I would say, in terms of what is our feminist future, I'm going to borrow what Kat said, which I hadn't heard you talk about before, that I thought was so brilliant, which is we need to reclaim hope. And not in a kind of facile, Pinterest board or, kind of Tumblr page inspiration, like let's have hope, but a sort of active, intentional hope. It seems like hope is a kind of radical politics at this particular moment, and I think that we need to engage in those radical politics to remember that it's not optimism, but it's hope that we can actually, by doing the work that we're doing and having other women and men do this kind of work, that we're actually hoping for something different. And we're hoping for change, and we need to kind of hold on to that.
Yes, we do. If you figure out how, you let me know, and then we'll do it. Okay, on doubt. So I think I'm always self-conscious when we talk about our book that we sound overly pessimistic about Me Too, both in terms of what it tried to do and also in terms of what it achieved. But I have to say, of course, I understand the impulse towards sort of truth-speaking as a political practice. There's this sense, and it was a sense that was very much underpinning the Me Too movement, that we kind of need to have a world of shared facts to have a basis for politics. And this was obviously Hannah Arendt's argument. And for too long, the violence that women experience, particularly sexual violence, has not existed in that world of shared facts. And Me Too was really an effort to install sexual violence as fact in public life. But I think where I am at right now is the world of shared facts has thoroughly broken down. Whether that's to do with the structure of the digital environment or the extent to which sort of epistemic nihilism has crept in, we do not have this sort of world of shared facts as a basis for politics, but we have to find ways to do politics anyway. And to me, that really is about shifting how we think about belief in the way that I was discussing, not belief in terms of believing what is factual or believing what is true in relation to the present or the past, but belief in the very possibility of a future. Because we're in these sort of very fatalistic times, like whether it's, sort of the extent to which wealth inequality has entrenched and how much wealth has concentrated in the hands of a few people, or whether it's the sort of catastrophic environmental degradation that confronts us. It's in the famous, I think it was Mark Fisher who said it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. That's probably never been truer than it is in this moment. And so I think the task is really to restore belief in the possibility of us having a future at all. And I think that there is a task there for media, because if I think about why the futures that are being offered by the far right are so top of mind, to me, it's because they mediate them. They mediate them as hypotheticals and speeches. They mediate them through AI. We've seen both the dystopian and quote-unquote utopian versions of that future. But I think many people, including especially young people, struggle to imagine how we ever move from the present into a future. We have to at least retain belief in the idea that the future is possible.
Thank you very much. Professor Gill, your work reminds us that anger is not the only feminist affect. How should feminist politics engage with the entanglement of anger with the rest of the emotions that your research has revealed?
Thank you. Well, first of all, I also want to say how brilliant your discussion was. Really, really good. And I hope it'll be published, because it was just absolutely insightful and incisive. I think the reason that I sort of felt exercised about that was that I was contributing to a special issue around rage. And I sort of felt as if anger, rage were just being sort of privileged, almost as if they were kind of like the truest, the most progressive, the kind of, most best emotions. And I wanted to just kind of engage them with the words and experiences and feelings of the young people that I've been talking to. And it's really just about kind of seeing them all together, because that's how we live our lives, isn't it? That we don't ever experience a pure emotion where everything's mixed up together, and disentangling it is one of our things that we do. And I just wanted to come back to what everyone's been saying basically, a bit about hope. And I think that's really, really important, just having an investment in the future and thinking about futurity. And it really made me so interested in what you said, Kat, because I think I'd thought about futurity so much in a critical way, about kind of reproductive futurity and critiquing that. But I think, what you said is so, so important. But I'd add to that, can we also kind of put the collective in as a key part of that, so that, because I think that's a real source of hope, not being so isolated, not feeling so much like a lone individual, but actually working together with other people. I could go on, but better not.
Okay, and the question to Professor Tsaliki for the Greek case: how can we resist the transformation of the feminist voice into a moral demand for confidence, resilience, and self-management? We've had enough of this, I feel, in the public sphere and in everyday life. So how can women speak without having to perform on all fronts?
I'll be very brief, because I know it's late and people will appreciate us wrapping up. So I would like to stay hopeful because I need to stay hopeful despite the fact that I feel disconcerted and really concerned about where we're going to, what the future will look like. To answer your question very briefly, I don't think there is a way out of it. You know, we will keep sort of fighting it, we will keep resisting it, but I think the systemic culture, gender culture, is so insidious and so well sedimented that we're just, you know, voices in the desert. I've started this new research with women over 45 in positions of decision making, and with the very, very few women that I've talked to informally, because the research is still ongoing. It seems that, you know, it's a shared culture. Once after a certain age, you come across a certain invisibility or certain expectation. So you need to perform, and you need to do aging in a certain way if you want to stay visible and be heard and be allowed to talk. And therefore, and unless you're heard and seen, then well, you can know you cannot change anything. Yeah, so you still need to be, you know, on scene in order to change something. Mm-hmm. So perhaps we need to, in academia, I mean, you know, the role of academics becomes even more important in times like this, because it's through academia, and hopefully in the US as well, it's through academia that policies can change, that opinions can change, that you know, you develop critical readers, critically thinking citizens. It's with knowledge that comes from us and then trickles down to the rest, you know, of the public sphere. Hopefully, yeah, and eventually we may change something. I don't know.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for being here until so late, and let us congratulate the speakers for the book. And goodbye.